So with that, we're getting to the final session of today's conference, which is going to be on climate change risks and biodiversity risks. We have two prominent speakers once again, and a distinguished professional, Dr. Anastasia Pappas. Anastasia, welcome. Cannot see you. Are you with us?
Yes, I can
excellent.
see you.
Excellent. Very good to see you again. We had met a couple of years ago when you had invited me for a talk in the E-Axis Forum. So Anastasia is the founder and director of E-Axis Forum. She has experience at Wall Street and in the financial industry. She holds a PhD from NYU. Anastasia, thanks again for being with us. And the session is yours.
Well, thank you, George, for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to chair today's session on climate and biodiversity risk. We have, as George said, two outstanding speakers, Mika Morse and Johannes Stroebel. So just some housekeeping. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for their presentations, and then we'll have Q&A for another 15 minutes. So we start with Mika, who will talk about why banks are abandoning climate promises. Now, Mika recently served as the lead policy advisor on climate risk and finance for Chair Gensler at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Before that, she served as senior counsel and deputy legislative director for U.S. Senator Brian Schatz. In this role, she was responsible for developing and implementing the senator's legislative priorities on the Banking Committee, the Commerce Committee, and Appropriations Committee. Mika received her JD from Yale Law School and her BA from Harvard College. She's now providing strategic consulting on climate finance and financial regulatory policy as the CEO and founder of Goldfinch Strategies. Mika, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Is my volume good?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Great. Can you see that all right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Maybe you could make it full screen.
Yes, let me try to do that.
That would be perfect.
Hold on one second.
Or if not, I guess that's fine.
No, I can. Let's just see how I can make it full screen, and then I can't find my Zoom to share my screen button. So let's see. There we go. Full screen?
Yep, perfect.
Perfect. So I recently left the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I was working on the climate disclosure rule under the last administration. And I'll spend just a little bit of time a little bit later in the presentation giving you an update on exactly what's happening with that rule. But in the course of my work there, I met with, over 125 investors, companies, investor advocacy organizations, academics, and others about sustainability strategies. And so many of the things that we learned in that process and are available in the public record, represented in the comments that were submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, revealed a lot of interesting things about climate commitments. And so I was listening to the earlier presentations around carbon emissions commitments and what we can learn from those. And I think some of the things that we learned really kind of set the stage for some of the things that we're seeing now. I mean, admittedly, the political climate in the United States changed fairly dramatically, and we've seen a lot of very high profile and very troubling policies come out in the first couple of months of 2025. But I think some of the seeds of the turmoil in climate commitments we saw taking shape in 2024. So I'm going to get into a couple of those reasons and consider what are some suggestions for how we can keep on track for net zero. So 2025 has been a very tough year for climate commitments, although, as I mentioned, some of this was starting in 2024. In the United States, one of the biggest things driving what we see as banks and asset managers leaving some of these net zero alliances have been antitrust attacks from the United States. Those have widely been panned as not having any legal merit, but it has really changed the calculus when it comes to the cost benefit of joining these alliances. So now we see a steep legal and political risk, and that was really what precipitated a lot of US companies abandoning those alliances. And as other panelists have mentioned, that does not necessarily mean that they've stopped doing the underlying work, but it does mean that it is more difficult for us to detect where they are in their transition journey. We've also seen politicization of climate and clean energy in particular. The previous panel was talking about how Texas is actually the largest state for clean energy in the United States, which is an incredible fact and just reflects how the economics have changed so much. But against that backdrop, the state of Texas has introduced dozens of bills that are seeking to actually kneecap clean energy, despite the fact that there's incredible supply and demand of that within the state. We also have a surge in energy demand in general. I think this is a global phenomenon, but it's very acute in the United States as we have large information technology companies that are trying to build incredibly large and energy intensive data centers to fuel their AI work. And we also have a move to try to onshore more manufacturing, as seen ostensibly by some of the policies that this new administration has been promoting, although we've yet to see that actually take fruit. So some of the things I wanted to point out is, a big red flag for me is the actual sort of attack on the concept of net zero. And I have a quote here by our new Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who denounced net zero carbon emissions as a, quote, sinister goal. And so I worry that we could see continuing attacks on this. And even as companies have left their alliances, there may be an effort to harass them using our Department of Justice by saying that just having a net zero commitment and referencing things like SBTI could be seen as a continued antitrust problem. So what have we seen actually as the results? I mean, we've definitely seen the weakening of those net zero alliances from the United States perspective. I understand, obviously, there are many, many members globally still. And we have banks starting to retreat on some of those net zero and sustainable finance commitments. And we've seen challenges around mandatory climate disclosures. I know Omnibus is proceeding, and there will be disclosures, robust disclosures in the EU. The question is, what will be the scope of the entities? We have very promising state disclosure regimes being led by California. But the SEC's climate disclosure rule has been challenged in court, and it has been abandoned effectively by the current SEC. So what I want to get into, though, is what's really behind some of this retreat. There is, political pressure, and there is sort of just a fear of what 2025 will hold. But I think there's a bigger thing underlying all of this. And this is something that came up in conversations that I had with banks in particular while I was at the SEC. And that is that their climate commitments hinged on assumptions about economy-wide decarbonization. And so, what they'll say in their public statements, and there's some really great examples of this, is that their concerns about their ability to meet their own commitments are reflected in concerns about where the economy is going in terms of the pace of the transition. But I think what that really meant is that banks were not prepared to stop financing high-emitting sectors when they were profitable, particularly under legal and political scrutiny. And so where does that leave us? We actually have much less information than we even thought we had about their actual transition actions. And so, this was a problem that the SEC rule was attempting to solve, was to try to address the fragmented and unreliable disclosures that make it very difficult to understand what lies behind very ambitious statements about what banks and other financial institutions were intending to do. We also see that there's a bit of underdevelopment in playbooks for profitable transition finance. I mean, I think this is a problem that is being tackled, particularly by Europe and the UK, and I think is a fertile area for these international alliances and organizations. But up until now, I think what it means to do transition finance and to do it well is something that there hasn't been a lot of consensus around. There's also an unmet need for better metrics. So we talk a lot about emissions. I think emissions are incredibly important. They're the way that we will track whether we are reaching our global goal of net zero. But from an individual company perspective, emissions is only a part of the picture. And so some of the things that we were attempting to get at with the SEC disclosure rule was an understanding of actual capital expenditures towards those transition plans, as well as financial statement level information about the effects of climate risks on costs and expenditures in the previous fiscal year, as well as where the material investments lay in terms of mitigating actually identified climate risks. And I've added here to the energy finance ratio as a KPI that I think we've seen more demand for. And I think that's interesting from a bank context, because I think that gives us real financial metrics to back up some of those claims. Now, I do think that we're in an incredibly challenged position right now. As other panelists have mentioned, part of this is just digging into the work. You've made your ambitious commitment. You start to figure out what you really need to do to make it happen, and you realize that it's harder than you expected. So to some extent, to expect linear progress was maybe too optimistic. And I think now, against sort of a very challenging political environment, there's actually an opportunity to take a more nuanced and tailored approach, and that the sustainability strategies that may come out of that process will be more durable. And so I think in particular, there are opportunities for alliances and international organizations to play a really important role in showing us the path forward. And so already we're seeing a growing focus on unlocking capital for climate solutions. And so what does this mean? So there's a certain amount of low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing your own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and even engaging with suppliers on your Scope 3. And for banks, there's a lot that can be done in terms of working with clients and customers along their decarbonization journey. But most of these clients and customers are existing within an economic system where there will be hurdles to deep decarbonization that affect the entire industry and are not something that any one company is in a great position to be able to solve. And that's where banks and asset managers and asset owners are in a unique position to see strategic opportunities to unlock those particular challenges. And so now might be the time, instead of sort of focusing so much on a very linear progress on reducing emissions, is just starting to map and identify those particular hurdles and figure out where your financial institution has the strategic advantage in investing in or trying to help support clients and customers that are investing in unlocking those particular challenges. I also think that we are on track to see disclosures improve. So we were watching eagerly as the ISSB was finalizing their own disclosure requirements, which had many similarities to what the SEC disclosure rule had. And I think, from our side on the United States, we're trying to figure out how to encourage voluntary ISSB disclosure for those that may not be covered by regulatory disclosure requirements. But then at the same time, we eagerly await, further implementation of CSRD and rules like the California disclosure rules, which will really cover an incredibly large swath of US companies that do significant business in the state. And we do see interest from investors in these transition metrics that I was mentioning, like the energy supply finance ratio. I think more work could be done there in thinking on a sector-by-sector approach. There have been a lot of work, obviously, in SASB on sector-by-sector metrics, but I think honing in on what are the kinds of metrics that demonstrate that someone is really effectively moving through their transition plan is a piece that I think will bring investors greater certainty about who is on the pathway for real decarbonization. And I think that these dynamics generally will be positive. So if we can kind of use the challenges that we're facing right now to deepen our approach, be more detailed, and try to come up with strategies that are achievable and closely aligned with generating returns, I think that we will find ourselves in a much better position as we get closer to 2030 and then ultimately into 2050 than we were under the sort of status quo before, which was, very broad, ambitious statements that lacked a lot of meat on the bones. Something that came up when we were working on the climate rule and was reflected in the comment file was that people were not exactly supportive of a requirement to disclose their plans to meet their commitments because they didn't have one yet. So I think we're going to see a phase where now, under pressure from these disclosure regimes and from investors, people will need to start actually developing those plans with more seriousness. So I have a couple of recommendations across banks, asset managers, funds, investors, and policymakers. And
Mika,
I want to be
I'm sorry, if you could wrap up. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, thank you. So some of these are just things that I have already mentioned that I think are ways forward. I would just say from the policymaker standpoint, I think it's important to keep up the vigilance in terms of integrating climate risk into prudential and systemic risk supervision. This is an important driver, both for getting companies to be very serious about not just saying things, but actually doing them, and making sure that that we have an eye on the kinds of risks that some of these actions, if not done well, could pose to the financial system. So I'll wrap up there and just flag that I think there are opportunities on energy demand and tackling physical risks, but I can get into that more in the question answer period. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation. Now, Johannes Stroebel is going to talk to us about biodiversity risks and how are they different from climate risks. Johannes is the David Loeb Professor of Finance at the New York University Stern School of Business. He's also the director of the NYU Stern Climate Finance Initiative. He has received numerous awards. Most recently, he was awarded the 2023 Fisher-Black Prize by the American Finance Association, which is given every 2 years to the top financial economist under the age of 40. In the past, he was associate editor at the Journal of Political Economy, the Review of Economic Studies, the Journal of Finance, and Econometrica, all the top journals. He regularly provides advice to governments and firms on managing their financial risks from climate change. He was a member of the Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee at the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. Before joining NYU, he was assistant professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He has a BA from Oxford and a PhD from Stanford University. Johannes,
Perfect.
the floor
Thank
is
you
yours.
so much. Thank you so much. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So what I want to focus on in the next 15 minutes is to think a little bit about where the academic literature in financial economics is on sort of drawing a distinction between climate risks, which we've heard a lot about today, and so this new category of risk on the horizon related to nature and biodiversity loss. Broadly speaking, the financial economics research in this area is motivated by this growing interest to better understand the various feedback loops between economic activity on the one hand and the health of our planet on the other, where the health of our planet initially started primarily focusing on the effects of climate change, both climate change affecting economic activity and economic activity affecting climate change. But again, more recently, there's this growing interest to better understand what nature and biodiversity loss might do. Again, same types of feedback loops, but really trying to understand, are those risks distinct? Are they the same? We started out by thinking, well, they're largely the same because it's the same type of people and the same types of panels worrying about them. And so, I think it was quite hard for the academic research to really try and figure out what are the key dimensions on which they're different and what are the many ways in which they interact. And so that's going to be, the point of the presentation today, to give you guys a very brief update on where the literature is on that space. So what are the similarities and the differences between these risks? Both sort of thinking about it from a conceptual perspective, the way that you would model these risks, but also empirically. Are different firms affected by them? Are different sectors affected by them, and so on? So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, it largely summarizes research from 2 research papers that you can find on my website if you're interested in digging in a bit more about this space. So let's think about the ways in which climate and biodiversity risks might be different from a conceptual or economic perspective. So if you think about climate change in economic models, the primary way in which most economic models, so this would be Bill Nordhaus's DICE models and many others that underlie things like the calculation of social costs of carbon, etc. Climate change in economic models is usually incorporated through a damage function approach. So you would model that overall economic output, Y, would be some function of what you produce. This F function here is sort of a function of capital and labor. But at the end of the period, some damages would come from climate change, which might be a function, say, of the amount of carbon emissions out there. And this damage function DZ, in some sense, will map total carbon emissions or total climate change into sort of total aggregate losses from climate change. What's really crucial about this is that in most of these modeling approaches, climate change doesn't really fundamentally affect the way the economy operates, right? So, the way that we produce things using labor, capital, and other factors of production remains relatively unchanged. It's just at the end of the day, some of what we've produced gets destroyed by wildfires or hurricanes or rising sea levels or something like that. So that's the canonical way in which most economic models incorporate climate change. The way that you can think about nature in economic models is actually quite distinct. The way that you would incorporate nature in economic models is through incorporating what we call ecosystem services as their own direct factor of production. So you can see that in the second equation here, that this aggregate E, these ecosystem services directly enter the way that the economy produces output. These ecosystem services can be a combination of what you might call provisioning services. So these would be direct things that we get from nature, such as timber, food, etc., that directly enter the production process. But I think more importantly, what you call regulating services, things like water and air filtration, nutrient recycling, pollination, etc. So many things that nature produce that directly enter the production function. And one thing that's really crucial to understand here is that many of the things that nature does in the way that they affect aggregate economic activity are both critical and really difficult to replace with other sources of capital. So there's a big debate about how substitutable nature's input to economic activity are with other factors of production. But if you take something like pollination, right? If insect-based pollination disappears, it's not easy or near impossible to say, well, let's just use more physical capital, because there's in some way no way to replace that process. If you think about maybe another ecosystem service nature provides, carbon sequestration, right? We have an enormous research effort to try and provide non-nature-based carbon sequestration through, industrial scale carbon capture and storage. And despite some progress, I think we're really far away from an economically feasible way of replacing what nature does in terms of carbon sequestration with sort of, replacing that with physical and human capital. And so when nature disappears, the way it affects economic activity might be much more dramatic than when we have more climate change. Why? Because it is a critical and hard to replace factor of the overall production. So we might not have any output that climate change could destroy at the end of the day, right? So I think this very simple model here kind of highlights, I think, some of the important conceptual differences in the way that nature loss and climate change might affect economic activity, financial stability, and so on. One little aside here is what I've done here is included an aggregate ecosystem service in the aggregate production function. What this way of thinking about the world and much of economic research doesn't speak to yet is how biodiversity affects economic output, right? So what is the contribution of an individual species to that very aggregate ecosystem services? And so just before, without going into too much detail, I want to point you to another paper that we released very recently, where we try and carefully measure go through the ecology literature to try and understand how to best represent insights from the ecology literature about the contribution of different species to the aggregate economic activity. I won't have time to go through that today, but I think it's important because biodiversity, almost by the definition of the name, the diversity part, the species richness part is there. And it's actually really, really hard to link disappearance of individual species to sort of an outcome of aggregate economic interest that you might care about, right? I mean, you could think about species having sort of values in of their own right. But if you're trying to figure out what the loss of a species might end up doing to economic activity, you need to think quite carefully about things like the redundancy of species in the type of function they play in the ecosystem. So, if you lose the last pollinator in an ecosystem, that's going to have much larger economic effects. And if there's much redundancy and there's other pollinators left, etc. So, we have a formal model of that in another paper that I don't have time to talk about. Okay, so here's the very simple model where you can think about the climate change and how you would model that, and in sort of a standard economic framework, and how you'd model ecosystem services or nature's contribution to economic output. And one interesting thing that you can then do with this model is you can say, well, okay, now we understand the first order effects that each of them have on economic activity, but there's obvious feedback loops between climate change and nature loss, right? And those feedback loops might actually be really, really important. And so the paper that I described above about that was called the twin crisis multiplier tries to take a stab at a very simple model of modeling these feedback loops. So let me just give you some of the intuition behind that model without walking you through all the equations. So think about our normal economic model where, if an economy has more capital, it produces more output. Right, so that would be the most standard classical model where neither climate change nor nature play a role. Now, I mentioned already that sort of the standard DICE, Nordhaus style models of how climate change affects economic activity that again are at the heart of essentially every calculation of the social cost of carbon, etc. More capital won't just lead to more output, but it will lead to more climate change because carbon emissions are a byproduct of economic growth in these models, and then that climate change will destroy some output, right? I showed you that before, right? So what now if in addition to modeling climate change, you model nature as well? Well, one really interesting thing, and this is what we call the twin crisis multiplier, is climate change will lead to nature loss, right? So climate change is one of the key drivers of nature and biodiversity loss. But also then when you lose nature, because nature provides a key carbon sink, you're going to get more climate change, right? So you're going to have these negative feedback loops between climate change driving nature loss and then nature loss driving more climate change. So that is going to be, in many ways, a multiplier on the total cost of climate change. You can think about it this way: 1 ton of carbon that you emit through an industrial process will destroy some nature, which will, through destroying a carbon sink, release additional tons of carbon. So if you think about the total aggregate carbon intensity of an industrial process through this multiplier of nature loss is actually bigger than just the carbon you measure directly at source. And so that will destroy some output. So we're going to call this twin crisis multiplier. And we're trying to play around with getting estimates of this, but this can be economically quite meaningful. Then you're going to have additional forces, right? So climate change driving nature loss, which leads to less output because nature is a factor of production. I just showed that to you. So that's an important additional feedback loop about how the total economic losses from climate change are bigger than just driving the wildfires. If you also kill more nature, then that's going to lead to less output. And a last feedback loop is to the extent that nature, things like mangrove forests, etc., provide natural adaptation to the effects of climate change. Right, so rising sea levels are going to have larger effects in terms of coastal erosion when nature is destroyed than when nature is rich. You're also going to reduce the amount of adaptation, which is going to further increase the economic damages from climate change. Right, so we have a very simple economic model in this paper that I described that captures these quite rich feedback mechanisms between climate change and nature. And one of the key takeaways here is that this climate nature feedback reduces the effective productivity of capital, or another way of thinking about it, it dramatically increases the economic costs from a ton of carbon emissions, because it doesn't end at that ton of carbon driving hurricanes or wildfires. It also leads to nature loss, which leads to more carbon emissions, leads to more costs from the same type of climate damages, and itself, it destroys a key factor of production. So I think this just gives you a sense of the various ways in which climate change and nature loss interact. In sort of from a conceptual perspective, my last minute or two, I just want to spend talking about risk exposures, in particular transition risk exposures for firms. And so we have another research paper where we estimate industry level rankings on both biodiversity transition risk exposures and climate transition risk exposures. And what you can see is that they're barely correlated. And I think one sort of, salient example of why they might not be perfectly correlated, to me, comes from the renewable energy sector, right? The renewable energy sector is clearly a sector that benefits from tighter climate regulations, right? So if you're a solar or a wind farm, you're a sector where climate regulation is good for you. But actually, environmental regulation is really problematic for you, because the build out of renewable energy has a large scale negative environmental footprint. Why? Well, wind farms, they onshore, they kill birds. Offshore, they distract the whales. Solar has huge land use requirements. So often you have to clear forests to build utility scale solar. Hydro dams, make it hard for migrating fish to pass. And so all types of, when you read the 10K statements of renewable energy firms, one of the things they complain most about is environmental regulation. Right, the Endangered Species Act, and so on, makes it really costly to actually run wind farms. And so I think understanding that in terms of risk exposures, it can be very different sectors. Some sectors like renewable that benefit from climate regulation actually really, suffer from environmental regulation. And I think just at a higher level, understanding that in many ways there's a conflict in the build out of renewable energy that gets slowed down by other sort of environmental concerns. I think trying to understand and wrap our head around this, that, there are environmental costs from renewable energy build out, and trying to think through what that means for the net benefit, in particular, once you take this twin crisis multiplier, this conceptual feedback between nature and climate change into account, I think is something that I don't think, we're starting to think about it on the academic side. I don't know how much this is sort of front and center in the way that, people in financial markets think about this. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. A very, very interesting presentation. We have one question for Mika that goes, SASB was pushing US SEC to be a player in forming regulation on the claim that their standards helped stock investors to get an abnormal performance. Recent well-respected research has documented that this is not the case. So SASB was marketing its product in a misleading way. What is your view on this?
Sure. So the way that the Securities and Exchange Commission operates in terms of regulating the market is, the SEC is subject matter neutral. So even in working on the climate disclosure rule, the SEC was not taking a position on climate policy or what was sustainable or what investors should be looking for or how companies should manage their risks. What we were doing was responding to demand from an actually really broad range of investors, including a lot of large institutional investors and many retail investors, that said that they wanted better, more reliable information about climate risk in order to make investment decision making. All of that is documented in what ended up being the final rule and can be found in the comment file. What we do from an enforcement perspective is when public companies or investment funds and advisors and others that have disclosure obligations under the SEC securities laws and regulations, if they make false or misleading statements, then those are things that the SEC can review and can ultimately bring an enforcement action against. And in that regard, in the previous administration, we did see cases where the SEC would bring cases against funds for advertising a particular ESG approach, but then not having the policies and procedures in place to implement their public-facing statements. As far as the empirical evidence around whether sustainable investment strategies yield returns, this is something that the SEC is agnostic on. So our view is that investors have different risk preferences and return appetites, and they're using information all the time that they find in order to make bets on that. And the obligation in terms of integrity for the market and attracting capital to the market is to make sure that investors are able to get that material information and make decisions that align with their own preferences. And so, we would comment, that you could even have people who take a very skeptical view of climate risk management and say, I want to invest in companies that are not, in their mind, wasting time investing in that. And they could have, in theory, used the SEC disclosures to identify companies that they thought maybe were over-investing in climate risk management, and invest in those instead. I think unfortunately now we're in a position that you just won't be able to get a very clear idea of what companies are really doing when it comes to climate risk. And I think that's going to put investors in a position of needing to pay a lot of money to purchase data or make suboptimal investment decisions for them.
Thank you, Mika. The next question is to Johannes. Do investors price biodiversity risks in assets valuations?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and it's one that this paper, that I talked about, biodiversity risk, looks at. What we find is that transition risk exposure is priced in the sense that if you take our measures of industry level transition risk exposures and you form long short portfolios on that metric, those long short portfolios co-vary in price with the arrival of news about biodiversity regulations. So it means that when regulation comes, prices adjust. Whether or not that covariance is associated with a risk premium. So in some sense, investors need to be paid a premium to hold those companies, that are more exposed. That relates a little bit to Mika's question on, what are the excess returns from those investments in the biodiversity space. That's essentially impossible to tell in finite data, right? Because we know that risk premia from investment strategies are about expected returns, not realized returns, and you would need many decades worth of data to honestly speak to that factor. So what I can tell you is that there is, the prices of more exposed property, of more exposed assets does decline upon the arrival of some of these, transition risk realization, which means investors do care about the realizations. Whether or not they care about them enough so that the more exposed properties trade at a discount or the more exposed assets trade at a discount, honestly, no data will be able to tell you. As you well know, there's many people out there that claim their renewable investment strategies, both in the climate and the biodiversity space, will have a positive alpha. Let me tell you, having spent more than a decade trying to find that in the data, if you take an honest approach to this, you'll never be able to answer this. Yes, you can look back and say over the last 5 years it made money, but whether or not that's because of one particular draw of a return realization rather than that this would have made you money in expectation, it's just not something that that data can tell you in a very convincing way.
Thank you. Another question for Mika. Does US SEC require investors to disclose their benchmark models relative to which they claim outperformance? If not, why?
Sure. So registered investment companies and investment advisors have various disclosure obligations, particularly around what their key investment strategy is. Some of the granularity of that kind of information, is not currently required. I will say that there were sort of two major developments while I was there that I think are related to this. One is a rule that actually did get finalized and will be going into effect for some later this year and for others into next year, which is around funds that have a particular name that might include something related to ESG. So previously, ESG funds were not required to comply with something called the names rule. And the names rule said that depending on what your name was, you had to demonstrate that 80% of your holdings were consistent with the name that you selected. So the new rule finally extended that to ESG related funds. And so that was then coupled with better, more structured reporting on the holdings that those funds had and the definition of what their ESG name meant. So now what you'll have when this goes into effect is a better definition around what one means by, an ESG fund or a green fund, how they define that. And then they will need to report on their monthly holdings, which of their investments comply with that name, so that 80% of their holdings are consistent with their name. That will bring some better clarity to what actually is meant and what the strategy may be, although I don't think it will give you insight into maybe some of their underlying models for how they construct their portfolio. The other development was a rule proposal around ESG disclosures, which would have provided, I think, the kind of information that the person asking the question is talking about. That rule was proposed but not finalized. And a big part of that was because there's so much innovation in this space that it was becoming very difficult to figure out what was even meant by an ESG focused fund. So, you had funds that integrated to some extent ESG criteria, and then some that on the other end of the extreme had specific impact goals that they were investing towards a particular outcome. And then you had everything in the middle, and drawing those buckets in order to impose enhanced disclosure obligations created a lot of questions and problems even within the ESG investing space and among investors, who then became concerned that as companies tried to figure out what side of the line they should fall on, it would potentially serve as a disincentive to integrate ESG into the definition of fiduciary duty. So it might sort of set ESG apart and say, if you're considering this at all, this is some sort of special add-on thing that, should necessitate a wide range of additional disclosures, rather than, I think, the trend for some where it was to say some of ESG is just so fundamental to what it means to exercise your fiduciary duty that it shouldn't necessarily cause you to have to identify as an ESG fund. And now with the change in leadership at the SEC, I don't expect that rule to be finalized, because I think there are probably very different views held by those that are leading the commission now on ESG in general. But anyway, so to that point, I think we will see more information, but maybe not the level of granularity that the question asker was looking for.
One more question for Johannes. Nature risks are extremely local and also depend on companies' dependence on the ecosystem. That implies that for financial institutions, this outside risk analysis is very difficult. What is a good approach to start risk assessment with limited information on location data? But I would like to add to this question, in view of this type of complexity, and we saw how environmental disclosures have, the regulation has evolved. Do you think that we will end up having, is there the potential for mandatory nature-related disclosures? And if so, how could corporations prepare for such?
Yeah, a bunch of good questions. I mean, I think on the, the transition risk side, it's much more straightforward and doesn't necessarily vary as much with location. I mean, it depends what specifically you're looking at. The dependency is important, but I think my sense is that in particular, when you're a bank or something, the types of nature and biodiversity risks that really start, becoming very material are not those where, like, if you're an industry that uses timber, you're affected and everybody else in a location is not. But I think it comes much more from the risks that come from what you might call a local ecosystem collapse. So, and we've had examples of those in history, things like the Dust Bowl in the United States, when, large parts of the, of the Great Plains states just became unlivable. We've had them more recently with the collapse of the Aral ecosystem in Central Asia, and we're starting to see them in the United States now, around a place like Salt Lake City or inland California, where I think collapses of ecosystem, often starting with, water scarcity, are really making entire parts of, like regional parts of country unlivable. And my sense is, those very much less of like this industry is going to be affected by ecosystem loss and this one is not. But it does have a spatial aspect to it, but I think it affects everybody. And I think those, certainly when you take the perspective from a more aggregate economic perspective, that's what you would care about. If you take an industry view, yes, smaller things like, are you directly reliant on a specific input from nature and so on? But those aren't meaningful from an aggregate perspective. So again, if you're a central bank and you're thinking about, financial stability, I think you care much more about the entire collapse of ecosystem, which will affect firms independently of sort of a direct way of measuring their dependence on nature. In terms of disclosures, I think absolutely. We have task force, of nature-based nature disclosures, very much modeling the TCFD framework, almost copying it one for one. My sense there is that like we don't, because nature risk is different to climate risk in a bunch of the ways that I described in my presentation, I don't think we fully have the understanding yet of what a sensible disclosure framework for nature looks like. And I think we're reaching the limit of how useful it is to basically just take the slides from the TCFD and replace a C with an N, and now they're the slides for the NFD, and like literally sometimes it is the same slides. It's just stuff moved around. I think we've limits to how useful the disclosure is going to be if we don't take a step back and actually go through a careful process of thinking about where these risks the same and where they different. And so I think we're probably, Mika described the challenges of having certainly mandated disclosure regimes for climate. I think we're, even further away before we can have sensible mandated disclosure risks for nature, because I think just even our understanding of the mechanisms through which the risk affects firms isn't there yet. And again, I think the approach we see in the literature is the one that you have in mind if you go through the ECB's biodiversity stress test. It's exactly this. It is how much are you lending to firms that are using nature directly as an input into production. But I don't think that's all that useful, because again, I think the big risks come from the collapse of ecosystems, which is not industry specific, but it is really something that it is sort of bigger than that if you're thinking about systemic risks.
Thank you, Johannes. I think time is up. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations and very interesting discussions. So I pass the floor to George now.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Mika. Thank you, Johannes. I think, there is a lot of scope there, especially in biodiversity risks. I think the literature has mainly focused so far on climate change risks. So it's really, important to delve into this, and it's very exciting. And I liked a lot these loops and the feedback effects, the twin effects that Johannes mentioned. And also Mika's perspective on the US SEC regulation is very timely. So thank you once again. And with that, we have reached the end of today's conference. I think we have all learned new things on timely topics and on challenges. So we had some very good food for thought. Let me thank once again our sponsors, our gold sponsor, Piraeus Bank, our silver sponsors, Alpha Real Estate Services, Demand, and Prodea Investments, our supporters, the CFA Society Greece, the Hellenic Bank Association, the Hellenic Fund and Asset Management Association, and the University of Piraeus Research Center, our media partners, the Business Daily, Capital GR, Euro Today, and Next Deal, the superb IFFR team, and Stavros Efthymiou, from the Research Center of the University of Piraeus. I think my humble view is that we delivered once again for a 5th consecutive year a high-quality, impactful conference which bridges the gap between cutting-edge academic research and the industry. Actually, this is fully in line with the scope of the Institute of Finance and Financial Regulation. Our aim is to get together cutting-edge research with the industry needs. We're very happy. We had a very wide attendance from all over the world, more than 700 people registered. I should say that the videos of today's talks will be uploaded in case you may have missed some of them. And there is also a membership list to which you can register in case you wish to stay in touch with the activities of IFFR. We have also distributed to you a questionnaire. We would very much appreciate your feedback. Your feedback makes us improve. So if you could please spend 5 minutes of your time, that would be very much appreciated. And with that, may I say goodbye to all of you. Good morning or good night, wherever you reside. And please stay in touch, and please send any recommendations you may have. And we're looking forward to seeing you again soon in one of our future activities. Bye-bye.